Howdy folks! In this video we're going to be looking at using override filters within the Calculate Revisor. It's probably the simplest kind of filter you can use in DAX. Therefore it's a really good place to start kind of seeing how this stuff works mechanically. Right. We'll do the other fun stuff later, and actually this part's fun too. It's all fun, but we're going to start right here, and we're going to start right about now. Speaking of which, without further ado, let's get down to business, shall we? I'm here in Filter Revisors, part 1.xlsx, and I'm in the Calculate Override tab. Actually, it's the Calc Override A tab. So we're going to start off with some pretty easy examples where we're using Calculate with a single override. Speaking of which, here's an example of using Calculate with a single override. There's Calculate, there's a single override. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself here, right? So what are we going to do right here? Well, in terms of like business terms, what we're actually going to be trying to calculate is the number of to-go units. So what we want to do is we want to calculate the number of units, which is going to be this code right here, but we want to do it with a filter for type equals to go, and we're going to use the Calculate Revisors to sort of achieve that, okay? So mechanically, what's going to happen? So we're going to sort of start running our code here, and the very first thing it sees is the calculate function, which is a revisor, right? So whenever you see calculate, same with any revisor, the first thing that you want to do is you want to freeze the sub-expression with your eyes, right? So the reason you want to do this is that it could be confusing to new folks that the sub-expression is actually the very last thing that runs in a revisor, right? So here we have one override filter, but in future examples we'll have 2, 3, 4, 5 overrides, right? And the very last thing to run will be this sub-expression right here. That's because this bit of code right here is the thing we want to run under the revised filters, and these are the ways that we want to change it. In this case, it's just 1, but there could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? So to help us remind us of that, right, we're going to freeze this with our eyeball. So I'm going to select this bit of code right here. Right now, in previous videos, to sort of simulate freezing it, to represent that graphically, I would change the font color to sort of this blue. Here, what I'm actually going to do instead is I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to change the background color to this kind of light blue right there to make it look like it's frozen in this big block of ice. It's the same general idea. The reason I'm doing this is because it makes it a lot easier to freeze and unfreeze it, more specifically, right? Same notion, though. This is the block of code that is frozen. It's in this big block of ice, brr, cold, right? And Calculate says, hey, I want to unfreeze this and run it, right? It is my sub-expression. It's the thing that I eventually want to run. But before I can run it, I have to revise the filters, okay? So, speaking of which, let's go ahead and revise those filters. Calculate says, okay, I want to go revise the filters so that I can run this. How am I going to revise the filters? Well, just like any revisor, it's going to go through 2 steps. It's going to perform current row filtering and then add override filters. Now here for this first part where we're adding any values of the current rows filters, current row filtering, also known as context transition, known by many names. The simple idea, though, is that if we're running our revisor within an expression column definition, what's going to happen is if there's any values of the current row, or I should say any values of the current row, will get added as filters. That'll be the first part of our revision. However, if you see right here, there's no sum x, there's no min x, no average x, no filter, no iterator whatsoever. Therefore, this revisor is not being run as part of an expression column. So there's no values of the current row to add. So Calculate says, are there any values of the current row to add? No, there are not, so we could go ahead and move on to our override filters, right? So for the override filters, well, with Calculate, it's anything beyond that first argument. So argument 1, that ends with a comma right there, is a sub-expression. Arguments 2, 3, 4, 5, 1,000, or however many you could add, those are all going to be override filters, right? There's some very advanced ways you could do some kind of trickier stuff, but for the most part, anything past that first argument is going to be an override filter. That's the way to learn it when you're starting out, right? And it's true 99% of the time. Okay, so this right here is going to be our override filter. What's it going to do? Well, we're going to evaluate this little bit of code right here, right? It's going to turn into a temp table that we can then add to our filter context, and then it'll create a new revised filter context that we can run the sub-expression in. Speaking of which, let's go do that. So let's go get all the different values of the type column, right? Regardless of what filters are in their filter context. For simplicity, the filter context is going to start out empty. But even if there was stuff in there, we would go get all the different values of type. So let's see, what are there in type? Well, there's to go and dine in. So I'm going to click over here. I'm going to do type to go and dine in. Go ahead, hit enter. Okay. So now we've gone ahead and performed that derivation where we get all the values of type, which we pass into the filter iterator, which will then add an expression column with this definition to it and just keep the true rows. Okay, so let's do this part first. Let's go add that column. And I've actually already done the hard work. I'm going to type in EXP, and as soon as I hit enter, I've already pre-populated the formula, right? So for every single row, check to see if that row's type, is equal to go. To go is, so we get a true. Dynamite is not, so we get a false. And what does the filter function do? It's just going to keep the true rows. So between those right there, what do we get? We get type, and we get to go, right? Okay, so this is the result of evaluating, turning into a value, this snippet of code right there, okay? And this is going to be an override filter. But I'm going to pause for a second, right? Because in this particular example, there's only one override filter. If there were 2, 3, 4, 5 override filters, we would go evaluate them all, go get all of our temp tables, and then add them all at once, okay? So if there was a second override, which we'll see in the second set of examples here, we would go get that one. But this is all of the override filters we've got, because in this example, we only have one override filter, right? There's no additional comma and third argument. Therefore, this is all the override filters. So let's go ahead and add those. To create our revised filter context. So I'm going to select that, left click and drag, and I'm going to hold down Control to make a copy. So I'm going to hold down Control and let go, right? It's more realistic to say that we move it from there into the filter context, but I actually like to see it in both places, which is why I held down Control to make a copy, right? So calculate says, hey, here's the temp table I need to add to the filter context, goes ahead and adds it. If there were others, it would add those as well, but we've just got the one. And now we've gone ahead and added any values of the current row as filters. There were no values of the current row as filters, so we could basically got to skip that step, right? We added any override filters. We evaluated them, right? Evaluated them, which is just the one, and then we added that as a filter to the filter context. Good. So we're done revising the filter context. This is our new revised filter context, right? With any current row filters, which there weren't any, and all the override filters, and there was just the one. Okay, so this is our new revised filter context with a filter for type equals to go. So speaking of which, let's go ahead up here and filter down to, assuming I can use my mouse, type equals to go. There we go. Now we're just looking at the to go rows of our mini table. Okay, good. So calculate is done revising the filters. This is our new filter context. It can now unfreeze that sub-expression and run it in that new revised filter context. So I'm going to select that big block of ice and go get my blow dryer out, stick it in the microwave for 30 seconds, and unfreeze it, right? The filters are ready and in place. We can unfreeze that sub-expression and run it with the new filters in place. Okay, so what's a sub-expression? Go get all the visible rows of mini, add an expression column with that definition to it, and sum up the results. Easy, easy. So I'm going to select those cells right there. Control-C to copy. Come on down here. Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on that little radio box right there and hit OK to paste values, right? And now what are we going to do? We're going to add an expression column with that definition to it, sum up the results. So I go over here, I type in EXP. I've actually already done all the hard work. So where it says for every row, get the units, well, we get 2 for that row, 1 for that row, 3 for that row, 2 for that row, and we sum them up because this is the SUMX function. So I come over here, I type in equals and sum, and I go ahead and I just sum those up right there. Easy as that. Go ahead and hit enter, and I get 8. Which is, by the way, the total number of to-go units. So this number 8 right there, that is what the actual calculate function returns, right? However, you might think we're completely done, but there's one more step we have to do, right? Calculate, like all revisers, is a good roommate, and by that I mean it cleans up after itself. And by that I mean when it makes a new revised filter context to run a sub-expression, when it's done running the sub-expression, it actually sets the filter context back to the way it found it. Okay, so to simulate that, I'm just going to go ahead and set these filters back. I've got this little swatch of orange right there, right? So I'm going to do Control-C, and I'm just going to sort of select over these and do Control-V to paste, right? So just to simulate getting those filters back to the way it found it, perfect. Now we've got 8. Let's set our filters back to everything. There we go. Okay, good. And that is that whole block of code evaluated with the filter set back. Perfect. Let's go do another example. These aren't that hard, really, right? Okay, so in this one, Business-wise, we're going to go get all the dinner units, which means we want to run a sub-expression that gives us a calculation of the total number of units, but we want to do so with an added filter for dinner, right? This is the block of code that's going to achieve that, okay? So how's it going to achieve it mechanically? What's it going to do? Okay, well, let's kind of start running it. Think like the DAX engine thinks, right? So the first thing it runs into, the DAX engine, I mean, is this calculate function. That's the first thing in the block of code. Calculate is a reviser, which means it's going to run a sub-expression under a revised set of filters. So we have to go find that sub-expression and freeze it with our eyeballs to remember that it's the last thing that runs. Not the first, but the last. Even though it's the first argument, it's the last thing that runs. So to do that, here's our sub-expression right there. But by the way, I've added these little comments where I've got the dash dash sub-expression and the dash dash right there. These are, anytime you have two dashes, anything after the two dashes is a comment. These are just little helpers to help you see that this is the sub-expression. If when you're writing your own code, you can actually add these yourself if that's quite helpful. But you don't have to, and the DAX engine certainly won't do it for you, okay? But here in these examples, I've gone ahead and done it to really help us see where that sub-expression is. If you don't see these comments, which you won't when you're running your own formulas, you got to remember it's the first argument. Hey, there's the first argument right there, okay? So let's freeze this. Let's remind ourselves that this is the frozen sub-expression, only to be run after the filters have been revised. So I select those cells. I right-click, come up here to my paint bucket, and I freeze it in a block of ice. Brr, cold, right? Brr, very cold. Okay, so this is the sub-expression that will get run under the revised filter context. Calculate then has to go revise the filters before it can run this. Well, how's it going to revise them? Well, two steps. It's going to perform current row filtering. It's going to say if there's any values of the current row, because we're running this inside of an iterator, we will add them as filters, right? That's going to be the first part. However, if we look right here, calculate is not being used as part of an expression column. There's no sum x up here or average x or anything like that. Therefore, this isn't part of an expression column. Therefore, there's no values of the current rows to add. So it goes to say, hey, do I need to perform current row filtering? It says, well, there's no values of the current row. So I'm kind of done. I don't have to add any values right there. There's none to add. Okay, well, that's only half of it, though. Then it's going to ask, hey, are there any override filters, right? And with the calculate function, override filters are anything past that first argument. So arguments 2, 3, 4, 5, 1000 are going to be override filters. And we've got an additional argument, argument 2, which is right there, right? Well, that's not the sub-expression. That's one of our override filters, right? So we need to evaluate this, and then calculate can add it as a filter, as an override filter. Okay, so let's evaluate it, right? So what are we going to do? We're going to go get all the values of shift, right? We're going to use the all derivation, which is going to ignore anything in the filter context. The filter context is empty, so it actually doesn't matter too much. So let's go get all the values of shift. Well, there's lunch and dinner still. Still. So I'm going to type in shift. We've got lunch, and we have dinner, right? So, okay, so we've got that derivation, right? So that bit of code produces that temp table right there, which gets passed into the filter iterator, which is going to add an expression column with this definition to it, right? And then it's going to just keep the true rows. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to type in EXP. And when I hit enter, I've actually already pre-populated this just to save us some time in the video. For every single row, we check to see if that row shift is equal to dinner. Is lunch equal to dinner? Nope, that's a false right there. Is dinner equal to dinner? Yeah, it sure is. So we get a true right there. What does the filter function do? Well, it keeps the true rows. That is the nature of the filter function, right? It creates a filter. So I'm going to type in shift, and we're going to keep dinner, right? And this temp table right here is the result of this whole expression right there, right? So this is going to evaluate to that temp table right there, right? Now, we do have to check and ask ourselves, are there additional override filters, right? Before we add this, we need to go check to make sure we've gotten all of our override filters. Well, if there was a comma and there were additional overrides, we'd go evaluate those. But since this is the only additional argument past that first one, this is the only override filter we have to worry about. So yes, we've gotten all of our override filters, right? Now we can go ahead and add them. So I'm going to click right here, select those, hover right there. I'm going to left click and drag. And I probably should just let go and move this into the filter context, but I kind of like to see a copy of it. So I'm going to hold down Control and let go to make a copy of it. That way I can see it both there and there. More realistic to say that I move it, I'm going to make a copy just for demo purposes. Okay, so we've taken this temp table and we've moved it into the filter context to turn it into a filter, right? An override filter for what it's worth. But honestly, I use the word override filter. Once it's in the filter context, it actually doesn't matter where it came from. Okay, good. So the calculate reviser has checked to see if there's any values of the current row. which is another way of saying, am I being run inside of an iterator's expression column? There's no sum x or min x or max x up there, so we're not, right? So there's no values of the current row to add. Then it says, hey, are there any override filters? Well, yeah, there's that one right there. We went ahead and evaluated it, turned it into that temp table, and we evaluated all the override filters. There was just one, so we just got that one temp table. Calculate adds that to the filter context. Hey, guess what? We now have our revised filter context. This is the new revised set of filters that we can run our sub expression in. So let's filter down to dinner. There we go. Okay, now we can unfreeze our sub expression and run it. So I select that right there, right click, come up here, and I'm going to give it this light gray. That's sort of I stuck it in the microwave for 30 seconds to defrost it. Aim the hairdryer at it, right? So we've unfrozen our sub expression. It's got this little kind of puddle behind it. And now we can go ahead and run it in our new revised filter. So what are we going to do? We're going to perform that derivation right there, go get all the visible rows of many, pass it into the sum x iterator, which will add that column to it, an expression column with that definition, and sum up the results. Easy, easy. So I select those cells right there. Control-C to copy. Come down here. Hold down Control-Alt-V. 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 Paste special. Click on values. Click OK. OK, good. So now I've performed that derivation to go get all the visible rows of many. It's going to get passed to the sum x iterator, which adds that column to it, sums up the results. So I come over here, type in EXP, and as soon as I hit enter, I've actually already pre-populated this. So for every single row, we get the units of that row. So we get 2, 1, and 2. And we sum up the results because it's the sum x function. So sum x takes that expression column 2, 1, and 2 and sums it up just like this. Just like that right there. Close the parentheses and hit enter. And we get 5, which is, by the way, the answer. So 5 is the value that the calculate function returns. It's the result of running all this code right here. It spits out the number 5, but calculate's not quite done, right? Calculate's a good roommate, just like all revisers, right? So in being a good roommate, just like all revisers, it's going to clean up after itself. Specifically, because it made this mess and created this new revised filter context, it's going to set the filter context back to the way that it found it before it calls it a day. Okay, so if you remember, the filter that we added was shift equals dinner. So to set this back, I'm going to go ahead and remove that filter. I'm going to find this orange swatch right there, Control-C to copy, and select those, Control-V to paste, just to set the filters back. Okay, calculate's done cleaning up after itself. It set the filters back to the way it found them. We can go ahead and filter back down to dinner and lunch. And just like that, we are completely done. Okay, let's go do one more example. One more example, okay? Business-wise, here we're going to get the total number of lunch units, right? So what do we want to do? Well, we want to calculate the total units, which is sort of what this bit's going to do right there. And we want to do it with an added filter for shift equals lunch, which is what this bit right there is going to do when we pair it with the calculate function. Notice our filter context starts out empty, right? Like most examples. Okay, good. So mechanically, what's going to happen? Business-wise, we want to get the total number of lunch units, but mechanically, how are we going to get there? Well, the first thing we see in our block of code here is the calculate function, which is a reviser. So anytime you see a reviser, you need to go find the sub-expression and freeze it with your eyeballs, right? Because when you're writing DAX, it won't freeze it for you. It won't tell you this is going to be the last thing that runs. So we have to get good at finding that sub-expression with our eyeballs and freezing it, reminding ourselves this will be the last thing that runs inside the calculate function. Now, the sub-expression is right there. It's the first argument of calculate. It's always the first argument of calculate. So I select that first argument of calculate, and I'm going to right-click. I'm going to come up here, select that little paint bucket, and give this light blue background. Brr, frozen, cold. Okay, so this is the sub-expression. It's frozen. Even though this comes before argument 2, this is actually going to run before argument 1, because this only runs after we revise the filters. Okay, so we've frozen our sub-expression, right? And now calculate says, hey, there's my sub-expression. I'm going to run this in revise filters. Now I have to revise the filters, okay? 2 steps, 2 stages, right? So first, it's going to perform current row filtering, adding any values of the current row as filters. This would only matter if we were using the reviser inside of an iterator, right? Which is to say, it was part of an iterator's expression column definition. So if there was like a sum x up here or an average x or something like that, and calculate was being used as part of the expression column, well, then we'd have to add the current row's values as filters. And we'll show you an example of that in a minute. But for right now, there is no sum x or max x or average x or anything like that up here. Calculate is not being used as part of an iterator's expression column. Therefore, there's no values of the current row to add. Okay, so we can sort of skip this step 1a. There's no current rows to add. or say check mark, we did it, right? Okay, good. So now we've added any values to the current row as filters. There weren't any, nothing to add. Now we go to step 1B, where we add any override filters. Are there any override filters? Where with calculate, an override filter is anything past the first argument. First argument is a sub-expression. Arguments 2, 3, 4, 5, 1000 are the override filters. So there's one right there, argument 2. That's an override filter. So what do we have to do? We have to go evaluate all of the additional arguments, to get temp tables, which will become override filters. We'll do it one by one, and then we'll add them all at the very last, the last step right there. Okay. So let's go ahead and evaluate this. So we're going to start by getting all the values of shift, and we're going to use this all derivation, which is going to ignore any values in the current filter context, which ends up not mattering because there's no values in the current filter context. So what are all the shifts? Well, there's lunch and dinner, so let's come down here. I'm going to type in shift, and let's do lunch, and let's do dinner. There we go. So that is that derivation right there. Now, comma, that's going to get passed into the filter iterator, which is going to add an expression column with this definition to it, and just keep the true results. So I come over here, I type in EXP, I hit enter, right? And so for the first row, it says, is the first row shift equal to lunch? Lunch is equal to lunch, so we get a true. Is the second row shift equal to lunch? Dinner does not equal lunch, so we get a false. And what does the filter function do? Well, it's going to keep just the true row, so just that row right there. So I come over here, I'm going to type in shift, I'm going to type in lunch, and hit enter. Okay. Now, if there were additional override filters, which we'll see sort of in the next video, we would go ahead and evaluate all of them to make sure that we sort of evaluate all of them, get all of our temp tables ready, then we could all add them at once. Now, in this example, since there's just one override filter, we're done. We've evaluated all of our override filters. Now Calculate can add them all. When by all of them, I mean just this one right there. So Calculate says, okay, go get all my override tables. There's the one right there. It's the only one. Okay. Calculate's going to add that to the filter context. So I'm going to left click. It's more accurate to say that it moves it, but I like to copy it. So I'm going to hold down Control. There's a little plus symbol next to the arrow there, and I'm going to let go to make a copy of it. I just like being able to see it in both places, both there and there for demo purposes. Okay, so it's taken this temp table and added it to the filter context. That's what the Calculate Reviser did, right? And that's all the override filters. So we went to see if there were any current row filters, current row values to add. There weren't any, so we're done with that. We created all of our override filters and added them. We're done with that. That means we're done revising the filter context. This right here is our new revised filter context for Calculate. Calculate has created this filter context, which it then is going to run this sub-expression in. Okay, good. So now let's filter down to just lunch. Filter down to just lunch. Now we could go ahead and unfreeze the sub-expression right there. It's only allowed to be unfrozen after the filters have been fully revised. There we go. So we've unfrozen it, stuck it in the microwave for 30 seconds, and now we can run it, right? So we're going to run this sub-expression in this new filter context with the filter for shift equals lunch. So what do we want to do? We want to go get all the visible rows of mini, that derivation right there. We're going to pass it into the SumX iterator, which will add that expression column to it, an expression column with that definition, and sum up the results. So let's go get all the visible rows of mini. There we go. Control-C to copy. Come down here, Control-Alt-V to paste special. Click on values and hit OK. There we go. We've derived all the visible rows of mini, which is just the lunch ones, right? And now we can pass it to SumX, which will add this column to it, sum up the results. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to type in EXP, and I've actually already done all the hard work. So when I hit enter, for every single row, we already get the units. So for each row, we get the units. So we get 2, we get 1, we get 1, and we get 3. That's our expression column right there. And what do we do with it? Well, it's the SumX function, so we're going to sum those up. So I come over here, I click equals sum, and I go ahead and I sum those up, closing parentheses, and I hit enter, and I get 7. 7, 7, 7. 7 is the result of this big block of code right here. 7 is what Calculate spits back out. However, we're not quite done. Calculate is a reviser, and like all revisers, it is a good roommate, which means it cleans up after itself. And by that, it's going to reset the filter context back to the way that it found it. It had to modify the filter context, create a new filter context to run this sub-expression, but since it's done running it and it's got the number 7, it's going to set things back to the way it found it, right? So what did it do? It added this filter for shift equals lunch right there. So Calculate's going to say, my, let me clean up after myself. Control-C to copy. Control-V to paste. Okay, good. It's done cleaning up after itself. Very good. So now we set the filters back to lunch and dinner. So we got the number we want, calculate, reset the filters, and we are all done. And that is an example of using override filters with calculate. It's probably the simplest kind of revision that you can learn, but it's really, really powerful and a great place to start. In the next video, we're going to look at what happens when you have multiple override filters. Really, it's just going to be more of the same, but it's good to see this many, many times. Okay, so I sure hope that was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.